Now, I know that many students, the vast majority, do not like written questions. So obviously we thought this would be a good session to hopefully put you at ease, because they are not as bad as what people think. But I appreciate most people do get into accounting because they prefer the numbers. So hopefully, like I say, at the end of this session, it will give you an idea of how to approach the questions, specifically the written questions for this exam. Okay, so firstly, let's just get into it a little bit with just a very brief exam overview. Again, I think most of you will know this, but it might be useful just to as a little reminder. So on this exam, there are 7 tasks. There are 100 marks on offer, which obviously means that you need 70 marks in order to pass, with it being 70% required. And you get 2.5 hours for this exam. So it is a longer exam. Now, for the written tasks, you have 3 on this exam. You have task 2, task 4, and task 6. So what we'll be doing is, within this session, we'll be trying to have a look at an example task for each of these to show you what could come up, but more importantly, how I would go about approaching answering some of these example questions, just, you know, what to look for, how to structure your answer, and then some little tips along the way as well. Okay, so we will be stopping after each task for you to ask questions as well. So obviously any questions that you do have, do pop them in the chat box, because we'll be stopping, as I say, after each task for us to look at and hopefully be able to answer any questions that you have. Okay, so starting with task 2 then. So for task 2, we would expect, like I say, we obviously don't know exactly what's going to come up on the exam, but based on practice material and examiners' reports, etc., we have a fairly good idea that we may expect to see a PESTLE analysis. So I would say that people find this one of the more daunting tasks, the task 2 one. And I think part of that is due to, you know, knowing what goes into what category, but mainly knowing how do I actually answer the written task related to this. So I'm not going to go through exactly what a PESTLE analysis is, because I would hope at this point you do know what a PESTLE analysis is. That should be covered pretty well within your study material. But what I'm going to do is show you how to actually apply that to a written task and show you how to structure the answer. Okay. So there is going to be a little bit of reading in this one, because as you know, with business awareness, because we've got these written questions, the scenarios do tend to be a bit larger. And I think, again, that's something that makes people feel a little bit nervous, because they feel that's a lot of information to digest. But again, all I would suggest is take your time, try not to let it overwhelm you, read through it line by line. And honestly, once you've broken it down, there's a lot of stuff in there that you won't need. It's just giving you some background information. Okay. Now, the other thing, before we look at this first task, there will be an element of taking off just your accounting cap here and putting on your business hat. Because for this exam, hence the name, business awareness, we do need to be able to look at a specific business and tailor our answers to that business. So it's not just about the numbers anymore. It is trying to put that business hat on, think a little bit more wider than you have done in the past, which I know not everyone loves, but it is such a requirement now within accountancy. We have moved on from the point at which it was purely about the numbers, and there is far more analysis as part of accounting now. And that will only get more, I think, in the future. So having those skills is very important. Okay, so I did say it was going to be a bit of a scenario, this, but, you know, I want to make this as close to what you might see as possible. And I just want to give a bit of a shout out here to Accountex, who provided some of the questions for this session today. So thank you to them. Okay, I am going to read this out to you, just for those, I know not everyone attends this where they're actually looking at the screen, so I will read it out to you. So this is our scenario. So let's just have a read through it, and then we'll have a look at what we need to do. So Organico Limited is a soft drinks manufacturer in the UK. They focus on producing premium brand organic and vegan soft drinks, which are low in sugar. The company has been trading for 6 years. The company prides itself in using natural ingredients to develop their own blends that provide nutrients and maintain a full flavour without using any low-calorie artificial sweeteners. Some of the ingredients used in the drinks are imported from other countries such as Spain, France, and Italy. The company is looking to continue to build its profile on social media to create a greater brand awareness like other popular and new brands, and update its online e-commerce ordering processes. So that just gives you a bit of a background about this business and what they do. Now let's get into some of the sort of key details and what we'll be using as part of the PESTLE analysis. So the directors of Organico Limited have been looking at producing a PESTLE analysis due to uncertainties arising from recent factors. Economic uncertainties have arisen after possible future changes in UK law and the government policy on the use of plastics. Organico Limited manufactures products which are consumed by the public and must adhere to strict laws and regulations provided by the Food Standards Agency. For example, rules on labelling, ingredients, allergies, and health claims. The uncertainty around political issues has caused a rise in taxes. This has caused a rise in the cost of living, and unemployment is rising. After a recent survey that was published, it was found that more people than ever before are opting for alternative organic and vegan products. However, competition in this market is rising rapidly, with cheaper alternatives becoming widely available. Okay, so quite a bit of information to digest there, but as I said, that top half really is just a bit of background on the company, which we can pull in certain parts if we need to, but the majority of what we will need is in this second half. Okay, now hopefully as you were going through that, and this is something that I will be doing in my exam, because the scenario will usually come first like this before it asks the question. One thing I would do as part of your process is mentally, as I was going through that, I'd be sort of thinking about the certain categories that we have as a PESTLE and thinking, oh, okay, that might fit in there, that might fit in there. Okay, just briefly, okay, at this stage. Now, let's have a look at what our question is. So we need to identify 3 PESTLE categories. For the 3 PESTLE categories identified, explain how this might have an impact on Organico Limited. And this is for 9 marks. Okay, so I would expect here that either you will have to pick the categories yourself, so it will tell you, as it has done here, the number of categories it wants you to pick, or it might actually give you them for you. So it might give you, you know, social, economic, whatever it may be, and you have to then fit the scenario into those specific categories. Or, as I say, it could be a little bit more open like this, where we actually have to decide which categories we want to talk about. Now, if it does that, like in this scenario here, try and pick the ones and try and match them up as best you can with the ones you feel most confident with. So there will be ones, I'm sure you're already thinking it, where you sort of feel more comfortable than others when answering questions. You kind of think, yeah, I'm really confident in being able to talk about it from a social perspective. So if you can therefore fit something in from a social perspective, do it. Okay, obviously, as I say, you might not get that luxury. You might be given the categories and you then have to search specifically for those categories. Okay, so now that we know what to do, again, I would be thinking about mark allocation. We have 9 marks on offer here, and we have to identify 3 PESTLE categories, explain how this might have an impact. So obviously there's going to be 3 marks on offer for each category, the explanation and the impact. Okay, so straight away, I would be splitting those marks up. So we've got 3 marks for each, which all of a sudden seems a little bit less daunting. Okay, now the other thing is If you are writing one sentence for these, you are not going to get 3 marks. So try and match up the number of marks available to how many sentences or points that you need to make. Okay, that at times could end up being slight overkill, but rather be slightly overkill than underkill. So, try and do that the best you can. So going back to our scenario then, let's have a look at what categories we have on offer. Now, obviously I've had to try and do this in a way that makes it as easy to understand as possible because it is a slideshow. So what I've done is highlighted the points that I would be focusing on here. So the first one that I would be looking at personally is this one here, where it states about products which are consumed by the public must adhere to strict laws and regulations provided by the Food Standards Agency. For example, this ruling ingredients, allergies and health claims. Okay, so straight away I'm thinking, okay, well, that seems to fall into the legal category, hence the strict laws and regulations. So we know that for this particular one, this specific sentence or two here is going to fall under the legal category. Okay, I would then either write your answer out for this one, which is a little bit harder to do on slides, so I've had to do it a slightly different way. So you can either write your answer out and then move on to the next one, or you can identify all 3 and then write your answer for each. Now that's what I'm going to do in this scenario here. So moving on to the next one, I would write about this rise in taxes, which has caused a rise in the cost of living and unemployment is rising. So that falls nicely into economic because it's talking about the rise in taxes, which has caused, as it says there, this rise in cost of living and unemployment. So obviously that has had an economic impact. So we'll be talking about how that would affect the business. And then lastly, we need to talk about, or the one I've picked, is this about this people opting for alternative organic and vegan products. So that would fall into, when it's talking about people's attitudes, that would fall into the social category. Okay, so we've got our 3 categories. We've got legal, economic, and social. So what we need to do now is write out those 3 categories and explain why these particular points fall into that category, and then write about the impact on the business. So let's bring up our categories here. So we've got legal, economic, and social. So please, 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 when you're writing out your answers to these, make it specific to the organization, to that business. That's why it gives you that section at the top that we were looking at that is very specific to that business. It outlines what they do. That is how you are going to pick up your marks. If you write general points, the chances are you might not get many marks. You might pick up 1 or 2, but certainly not close to full. Okay, so in terms of the format of how I would answer these, I would basically state what the consideration is and why it fits into that category. I would then go on to explaining what impact that has on the business. Okay, so what it is that they're considering and what impact it could have on the business. So let's first look at legal. So we've gone with here, legal factors that may impact Organico Limited are the changes to laws and regulations from government bodies, such as the Food Standards Agency, which may have significant impact on Organico as food and drink manufacturers must adhere to strict guidelines. So I want you to see straight away, we have made it specific to this scenario. We've said exactly why this legal factor will have an impact on this specific business. Okay, so we've linked it back that they manufacture food and drinks. I would then go on to the impact. So it is important that Organico Limited is up to date with any changes and implements any new rules and guidelines within the correct time frame. As we said, how they almost need to combat this. And if not, and this is your impact, the business may face heavy fines or legal battles. Okay, so you can see there we've got a number of points to cover off this scenario. So we've said that we've selected the legal category, why this particular and specific point relates to this organization, and what impact it will have on the business. So we will now follow a very, very similar format for the economic category. So economic factors which may impact Organico Limited could include the rise of taxation, which we've taken straight from the scenario, the rise in taxes and the cost of living, which again is taken from the scenario, may lead to a reduced disposable income of customers, which obviously it will. That is the cost of living crisis. This is enhanced by the rise in unemployment. This may cause a reduction in demand for premium brand organic and vegan friendly drinks. So this is why it's specific to this organization and why it's a problem. We've said in the scenario that they make premium brands. If people have less disposable income, maybe they'll opt for cheaper options, which is covered in our last line. This could lead to a reduction in sales with the availability of cheaper substitutes from other new competitors. Okay, so that is your impact on the organization. And then lastly, we have social. So again, we've highlighted why this category fits in social. So social factors which might impact Organico Limited are the increased popularity of organic and vegan products, which has increased and has contributed to the success of the business. However, there is continued competition, which again, taken straight from the scenario, and some regular customers might have been lost who are looking for a cheaper alternative brand. The business may need to increase its range to include cheaper products so as not to lose customers. Okay, so hopefully from this, you can understand the format of how you would go about answering them for these three categories. But obviously, if it was the other three categories, you would still go about it in the same structure. Okay, I've done a lot of talking there. Hopefully that has provided some guidance. Jaden, do we have any questions related to what we've covered so far?
Yes, we do have a couple. So, the first question we have is from Melissa, and she was asking, could point two also be political?
So this is a really good point to raise. You can use the same point, but come at it from a different angle. I think people get very, very nervous about having to absolutely sort of put each one into one sort of siloed category. Whereas actually, one point in theory could fit into more than one category, but it is the angle at which you look at it from. So hopefully that sort of covers that, because it could,
Yeah.
but you are coming at it from a different angle.
Yes. And I think that also answers the second question, which was could the employment be social as well? But I think that falls within the
Absolutely.
answer
Yeah.
question.
But you need to talk about it from a social perspective, sort of thing. And that is what's absolutely key, that your answer is then tailored to that category and that business.
Yes. Okay, and Emma Louise has asked, are you marked down for any spelling mistakes?
So we don't exactly have the full, we're not privy to the full exam mark scheme. However, there can be, depending on how it's marked, there can be marks related to grammar and spelling, but unfortunately, we aren't actually privy to the live exam mark scheme. So I couldn't say for definite.
Okay, because
However, the only thing I will add is the vast majority of the marks will be related to the points that you're making.
yeah, exactly. And I think I can shed a little bit of light in relation to that. So you wouldn't be marked down for spelling mistakes specifically, but you just have to make sure that what you're saying couldn't be like mistranslated into a different word. As long as they can understand that's exactly what you mean, I think you'll be fine. So yeah, that's what I would say on that. But I believe those were actually. Let me just double check. Okay, and do we have time for one more?
Let's have a look. Yeah, we've got time for one more. Yeah.
Okay, and Tasha just asked, how much time would you allocate for the written questions? Although that is that one we should answer at the end, or do you want to answer that now?
We can do. I think it is a very tricky question to answer, and I think it's part of your exam practice, because you could, in theory, split it based upon the marks available, and that is available within the examiner's report. It will give you like the notional time for each question. However, I take those with a pinch of salt, because certain questions will take longer, even though they are the same amount of marks, because you've got like reading time involved in that as well. So you can't just base it on the number of marks available if you've got a huge scenario to read through. So I would say it should take you almost as long as it takes you to answer it thoroughly, but you will have a good idea from doing mock practice if you can complete everything within the time available. Because what you'll find is that you are quicker than other people on certain questions, but maybe you take longer than them on the written tasks. So it is really hard to sort of say. If you feel that you've got good points to make, then I would take the time to make those, even if it takes you a little bit longer, because you'll be picking up a lot of marks. Whereas if you feel I've not actually spent that long on this, but I've got nothing else to add here, what I would do is move on and then come back to it at the end, because sometimes by reading through it again, you might pick up on an extra couple of points. But I wouldn't stress yourself out too much if you feel that you've got nothing else to write.
Perfect. Okay. All right. We do have one more, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll pass that to you on the second break.
Okay, no worries. That's absolutely fine. So this second one is actually a little bit smaller. So this is task 4, and it does cover a sort of wider area within the syllabus, but this is on ethical and legal compliance. Now, what I could say is that I would expect to see, given the task name, that we would extend materials that have been made available, that we could see something on some sort of ethical scenario. So that is what I've gone with here to show you, again, an example of how I would approach this question. Because again, where I've seen people lose marks on this one is not actually a lack of knowledge. They're just not writing or explaining it well enough. They're just keeping their answers too brief. So let's first have a look at the scenario. So Simon Fuller works for Adams & Co., a firm of accountants in Bridgetown. During the week before Christmas, Petra, one of the owners of a local restaurant, which is one of the firm's clients, turns up at the office with a crate of champagne. Petra hands it to Simon together with a Christmas card and wishes him a happy Christmas. Petra says, tell Roger that I've arranged the table for your firm's Christmas party on Friday and not to worry about the bill as it's on us. Okay, so Petra seems like a particularly generous person. However, we know that this is going or could cause an issue. So the first one we need to answer is explain the threat arising in the situation above. So hopefully we know our principles and threats by now. So I generally remember these through PIPCO for your principles, and as if, which is ASSIF, for your threats. Okay, so just a nice little way of remembering them. If you have a bit of a mind blank during the exam, hopefully you can note those down and then fill them out. So Again, something that we've seen on this, and it's one to watch out for, people start writing about the principle rather than the threat. So it specifically says, explain the threat arising in the situation above, not the principle. Okay, so we see a lot of answers related to this with talking about objectivity, but the main point you need to make is about the threat. Okay, now hopefully for this one, you have been able to identify what the problem is here. Now, because they are offering significant gifts to the business, that would be a self-interest threat, because obviously that would then potentially affect objectivity, but the threat specifically is a self-interest threat. Now, this is worth 2 marks, and it is an explain question. So we cannot just put that this is a self-interest threat. Yes, you'll get 1 mark. You will not pick up the 2 because it is an explain question. It's worth 2 marks. So what we need to do is tell the examiner what threat is at risk here and explain why, again, specific to the scenario, why it is a threat. So we've gone with, there is a possible self-interest threat here. Self-interest threats may occur where a financial or other interest will inappropriately influence the member's judgment or behavior. Now, did we specifically need to add that line in? Maybe, maybe not. But we want to ensure that we pick up both marks here. So therefore, I think it's worth doing. The offer of champagne would be seen as a high value gift. This, along with the offer of paying for the meal. So again, we've referenced both points in here, not just one, both points. For the meal would be of significant value and therefore cause a self-interest threat to Simon's objectivity. Okay, so yes, we've mentioned objectivity, but we've been very clear about what the threat is. Okay, again, like I say, where people lose a mark here, it is just generally not explaining it well enough. They just write that it's a self-interest threat, or they actually talk about the principle rather than the threat. Okay. In terms, you might think, well, why would somebody do that? It clearly states the threat arising. However, in an exam scenario, it isn't uncommon that if you come across something that you feel, actually, I know about this, you get quite excited, you start writing away, and actually you forget to read the question carefully. So we've seen some absolutely fantastic answers explaining objectivity on this. However, it, like I said, is asking about the threat. So it is easy to misinterpret a question. Okay. And obviously, like I say, you would come out the exam thinking, I've absolutely smashed that question. And actually, you've got 0 out of 2 because you've written about the wrong thing. Okay. Okay, so on the same scenario of following on from this, the next part states, explain the actions which should be taken in response to the ethical issues arising in this situation. Okay, so again, 3 marks on offer. This is not going to be a 1-sentence answer. We need to explain again a little bit about the problem, how we should respond to it, why it is a problem to our ethical issue, our ethics as a business. Okay, so try and break down the question. People might look at that and think, how am I supposed to extract 3 marks in answering that? Break it down, explain the actions that should be taken, what ethical issue is arising to that business. Straight away, that separates 2 points. Okay, so this is what we've gone with. Dealing firstly with the gift of the champagne. So we're breaking down the scenario. There are no specific rules for what gifts may be accepted, which is true. This is ethics, remember. We're applying it holistically to a scenario. It may be that this is a normal Christmas gift from the restaurant. And if the gift were to be accepted, it should be logged and distributed among staff rather than kept by the individual. Now, the on-the-house staff party is excessive. This is likely to be worth several £100s, and this should be politely declined as it could be seen as unethical to accept gifts such as these. The business should have sufficient safeguards in place to prevent them being seen as a threat to independence either now or in the future. Okay, so we have extracted every part of this scenario. We've left no stone turn, because we can't, when we're trying to answer these, we're trying to pick up a number of marks. So when you're doing this, please do break down the scenario, break down the question that's being asked to hit as many marks as possible. Okay, so that covers what I want to cover on task 4, because we'll need a little bit longer for the last task, which is task 6. Do we have any questions based upon task 4, Jaden?
So we do have a question, I believe it's for task 4, but I will ask them. Melissa did come back and she asked if you could add an extra factor.
If we could add an extra factor.
Yeah.
I am maybe thinking that relates to the previous one.
It could be. Maybe I got to it after.
I feel like that probably was, based upon what I've covered in this task. If that was the case, obviously it did ask only to cover 3, so I wouldn't be adding any more. I would only talk about 3, like I said, because it's asked for 3. So there's no negative marking. However, at that point, you have ignored what the examiner has asked for, because they've said, give me 3. This is back on the PESTLE analysis, by the way. If they've asked for 3 categories, don't give them 4. Give them 3, because that's what they've asked for. Okay. It may come across like if you've given them 4, you don't really know what you're talking about. So you're just trying to cover all bases. It's a bit like when we've had questions before where it's sort of, describe the main threat, describe the main principle, and people have put 2 or 3 down to try and cover them. You unfortunately get no marks, because it only wants 1. It wants the main one. So if you put 3, you're probably going to get nothing, because again, it's showing that you've not really understood what the examiner is asking for. Okay, hopefully I have answered that one.
No, yeah, I think that was perfect. There was one more, although again, I'm not sure if this was for task 4, but I think Marion was asking, if the question is asking how the categories will identify, let me read that again. If the question is asking how the categories identified will impact the business, does that mean we don't have to come up with solutions?
Not necessarily, no, because in theory, in the question, it should then state that you need to show impact and possible solution. However, if you are sort of struggling for points, or you are, you're confident with time, adding that on the end wouldn't hurt your marks. There would be definitely no negative marking for that. So if you feel like you would like to put that on the end as a solution, but it doesn't ask for it, obviously if it asks for it, then put it, but if it doesn't, and you want to add maybe a sentence on the end, just, to cover it off, they won't negatively mark you for that. So like I say, if you've got the time to do it, it wouldn't hurt.
Perfect. All right, I think it was just those ones, so we can proceed.
Okay, so like I say, we need a little bit more time for this last one, no more than what we did on task 2 though. So task 6 is about data visualization, and this again is not a popular one. However, I actually think this is probably the easiest one out of them all. This one generally is about, you'll have seen it if you've done any mock exams, about analyzing graphs or analyzing data and talking about it really. Now, a lot of this is a say what you see scenario. So you really are just taking what has been given as part of the charts and putting it into words. Okay, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. So firstly, just having a look at the scenario quickly, you work in the finance team of Cooper's Co. The owners of the business set out a plan to grow the business at the start of the year. There have been some concerns over whether the initial plans have been adhered to, and the owners have been asked for a progress report to monitor whether their plans have been a success. You have pulled together the following information, and we can see on the side here, we've got three charts. We've got a little profit or loss, just showing income and expenses. We've got expenses for Q4, which that's what we're dealing with here. And we've got the sales for Q4, broken down between budget and actual, and then the months, so October, November, December. Okay, now, the first question that we have on here is to explain to the owners of the business how sales have performed in comparison to the budget for 3 marks. I really do think these are quite straightforward, and people do sometimes panic over them unnecessarily because we literally are spelling out what has happened from the information available. Okay, so I would go through, for this example, it's saying, let's just read the question again. So explain to the owners of the business how sales have performed in comparison to the budget. So we are looking at this bottom right hand graph, so sales for Q4. And all we need to do is literally explain to them month by month how the business has performed. So I would quote the budget for October, I would quote the actual for October, and I would say, you know, whether it's favorable or adverse or better or worse than expected. And I would do that for October, November, and December, and then sum it up at the end. And by doing that, you'll get all 3 marks. So it's actually dead straightforward. So I've got my example answer here. So the sales information for Q4 covers October, November, and December sales. Sales for October were 107,920, which we can see ties up with the actual. This was 15,850 higher than what was budgeted, and therefore a favourable variance. In November and December, the business were underperforming. Both were adverse variances, 15,540 in November and 1,710 in December. The largest variance in sales was therefore in October, which was favourable. Taking into account the full quarter for sales, there was a 1,400 adverse variance. Overall, it isn't a large discrepancy, but the monthly budgets may need revising going forward. So we can see it is not an over complex answer. We are just spelling out what has happened to the examiner. Remember, you are writing this to somebody, well, obviously the examiner has financial knowledge, but you are pretending that they don't. So we are spelling out exactly what has happened. You need to assume that the examiner knows nothing. So therefore we are spelling it out month by month and then giving them an overall performance. And that would get you your full 3 marks. Okay, and we can see there we've got 3 or 4 sentences to cover us. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense on that first one. Let's have a look at another one then. So the target net profit for the business in Q4 was 150,000. Explain to the owners how the business has performed against this target profit, including any potential reasons why there has been a variance in target and actual profits. Now, again, we need a little bit of analysis here. So we've got 3 marks on offer. We can see that our income is 336,910 and our expenses are 214,000. So the first thing that I would do, calculate what the actual profit that's been made in Q4 is. So to do that, I would take the income, take off the expenses, and that will give you the profit. Once you've done that, compare it to what the target was. Okay, and that's really going to be step 1 of how to answer this question. I would then move on to what potential reasons there were. Now, let's bring up the answer. So the target net profit was set at 150,000. The actual profit was 122,910. This is an adverse variance of £27,090. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more complex, but again, it's just using the information that we've been provided. We've just spoke about the sales variances, that overall they were £1,400. Therefore, we know that if we have an adverse variance of profit of 27,090, but our sales variances were only 1,400 adverse, then the majority must be related to higher expenses than expected. So what you don't want to do in this scenario is put, oh, this was down to the adverse sales. Well, it's not, is it? Some of it was, but the majority would be down to expenses. Okay, so just be careful when answering these questions that you are specific to the scenario. I know I keep saying it, but it's so important. Okay, so I've said why why there is that higher adverse variance, and then I've finished up with it would be worth the business looking into their overheads because it's related to expenses to see if there are any potential reductions, and that would improve profit going forward.
This is a demonstration of Wirecast.
So that covers what I wanted to cover for the 3 tasks, and hopefully that has given you an approach as to how to go about answering the questions, and B, giving you an idea of how much you need to write to pick up full marks on each question as well. Because when I've been doing these sessions and doing revision sessions, etc., the overwhelming majority of people have said that they probably are not writing enough. And then there are a small percentage who say, actually, I'm writing way too much. And they've basically written what they've learnt in the entirety of business awareness to answer the question, just to try and cover themselves off. You can't do that. You need to be as sort of specific and to the point as possible.